The following is a presentation from the 10th Annual Humanities Days at Montgomery College. The power of humanities to sustain and serve. This year, we offered 32 events via Zoom and in person. To learn more about Humanities Days at Montgomery College and to access other program recordings, please go to this website.
Welcome to the 10th Annual Humanities Day at Montgomery College. My name is Jennifer Ball, and I'm the Creative Project Manager for the Office of Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs at Montgomery College. And I would like to introduce you to today's host, Ken Jassy, coordinator of the Art History program on the Rockville campus, who will present today's Humanities Days event titled Returning Stolen Art.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you all for coming out today, and I hope you will also attend some of the other Humanities Days events, which are well worth seeing, and I think Jennifer's done a wonderful job. I'll go straight into my lecture, and then I want to not go too long because I want to make sure people have some time for discussion and questions and comments. So let me begin with returning stolen art. On June 13th, 2022, the Board of Regents at the Smithsonian Institution voted to, quote, deaccession 29 Benin Kingdom court-style artworks in the collection of the National Museum of African Art and transfer the title and return the artworks to Nigeria's National Commission for Museums and Monuments as the representative of the federal government of Nigeria, unquote. And let me bring up my PowerPoint. So I have something, since it's an art-related lecture. This step, which has momentous implications, did not happen suddenly. Officially, it began in November 2021, when the National Museum of African Art petitioned the Smithsonian leadership to, quote, seek approval to deaccession and then to repatriate artifacts that were looted by the British in an 1897 raid on the Royal Palace. Now, tells us something, and we'll get more to it a little bit later, about the bureaucratic practice of museums, that it's not just simply saying, oh, we should give these works back, and then you just hand them over. There's a lot of steps that takes place, and this whole process, as we'll see, goes back a number of years. These artifacts, which have been part of the collection of the National Museum of African Art, were among many thousands of objects seized by the British military in the 19th century. And I wanted to show you a couple of them, but the Benin Kingdom, you can see from my map here, was now part of southern Nigeria, but until the late 19th century, it was an independent kingdom. An example of a couple of the 29 art objects that part of the collection in Washington, Smithsonian, the National Museum of African Art, and are going back to Nigeria, include this bell, which is something that would have belonged on a ancestral altar. And as we'll see in a minute, the shape of it was modeled after or mimicked after the roof turrets from some of the royal palaces in Benin City. And smaller versions of these bells would have been worn by soldiers going into battle. And it was meant to make a sound to both startle the enemy, their enemies, but also create a kind of cohesion among the soldiers. More commonly associated with the Benin Bronzes are these metal plaques, and they tend to have depictions of rulers, or in this case, a warrior or chieftain with all the arms and accoutrements. There's also smaller figures such as musicians and court pages, and even depiction of some foreigners, possibly Portuguese. We'll talk about Benin art in a little bit more in just a moment. The agreement to return plundered art is extremely important, although of course it's belated. It's taken more than 100 years, but it does mark a turning point. I won't go so far as to say that 2022 represents the year of returning stolen art, but I guess that's part of what my title of my talk suggests, but that many more museums in assorted Western countries have at least embraced the theory, if not the practice, of repatriation, deaccessioning, or whatever the favorite euphemism is of the moment. Of course, there are still notable holdouts, most prominently the British Museum, which is the repository of the vast majority of the not so aptly named Benin Bronzes. And I say that because many of these objects are technically not bronze. And I'm not a specialist in metallurgy, but bronze is an alloy, a mixture of copper and tin, which is not the same as brass, which is an alloy of copper and zinc. And there's a lot of other materials involved, but that's the title, the Benin Bronzes, that stuck. But again, just so you know, it's not simply a case of bronze objects. A lot of different metals. Before discussing the growing consensus in 2022 around returning stolen art, let me first give a little bit of background about the Benin Kingdom and Benin art, and also the British Punitive Expedition of 1897, some of which I touched on in a talk I gave last year on traditional African art. So the Benin Kingdom is, you can see actually in this map, Benin City is over here as the capital of the kingdom. And it was a powerful, centralized political entity in what's now southern Nigeria. It was established in the 13th century by the Edo people and ruled over by absolutist kings known as Oba, O-B-A. This print by a Dutch visitor in the 17th century shows a large urban expanse, very large population, and a modern civilization. The scene in the foreground shows a royal procession with the king on horseback. And to have a horse was a important, prominent source of prestige. There's lots of soldiers, a large, powerful army, as well as retainers and even pet leopards, which the rulers did have and actually were symbols of royal authority. And although the kingdom came to an end in 1897, there still are Obas today, and they have, that still have a great deal of prestige, but only enjoy a ceremonial role rather than having real political power. Art of the kingdom, especially metal objects, and metal was certainly in demand, were part of a royal monopoly and used to exalt the ruler who might not be surprised to learn was referred to as the great head. And so sometimes, as in the case of these pair of images, that sculptures of these rulers sometimes only depicted their head and neck. And these were objects that would have ultimately been placed on a shrine to the ruler, which would reaffirm his connection to his royal ancestors. There have been many art historical studies about the style of the art of the Benin Kingdom, because there's a good record, because you have metal objects that don't deteriorate, and especially of these royal heads, in which we can see a progression from greater realism to more stylization and abstraction. That is, they become less naturalistic over time, more individualized to start, although there's still a fair degree of idealization. In the case of both of these sculptures of kings, they're meant to indicate great wealth, and that comes from the beaded necklaces and beaded hair and other jewelry, suggestion of power based around the crown, and the one on the right, a pair of horns, and as well as beauty, having a long neck, and even superhuman qualities, as in the fact of the enlarged eyes, which give the sense of an all-seeing ruler. And with many of these, and it may be a little hard to see, there's an opening at the top which would have held an elephant tusk, a really long one. And that was another prestige object, which would set the king apart from everyone else. Another prominent figure in the kingdom who was also much represented in the art was the Queen Mother, or Ioba. And the mother of the king was a trusted advisor and a source of inspiration to the royal family and to the kingdom, and would be represented in metal sculptures as well as in ivory, as is depicted here. This is a relatively small object, almost 9.5 inches high, and it was meant to be worn. It's a so-called waist pendant, and could be worn by the king, including when he would go into battle, again, as a source of inspiration. Above the head and below the chin of the queen, you have a number of smaller images here, which sort of alternate with each other. Some of them represent, you can see by the tail, fish, so-called mud fish, which were associated with a creation story, and also with a water deity. And then the other figures in between, who are bearded, represent foreigners, especially Portuguese people. And the Benin rulers had trading relationships and an alliance with Portugal. Westerners were particularly interested in ivory, but also carved ivory objects, in which Benin artists were masters, including the salt cellars, or might call salt shakers, which were commissioned to be made for prominent people, including royal patrons. In exchange, Benin rulers obtained weapons, and that meant muskets and gunpowder, as well as metal in general, which gave the rulers their armies an advantage over their neighbors and permitted them to expand their empire through conquest. And images of Westerners, of foreigners in Benin art, interestingly enough, given what happened later, were generally positive ones. And here, like here, they represent sort of a protective motif, or even like a good luck charm. That relationship of relative mutuality between the Benin Kingdom and Europeans would change dramatically in the late 19th century, beginning a period which many Western historians describe as the, quote, scramble for Africa. Roughly between the years 1870 and 1914, in which the share of African territory controlled by 6 European powers increased from 10% to 90% of Africa overall. Specifically, the Benin Kingdom, the independent Kingdom of Benin, came to an end as a result of the infamous British Punitive Expedition of 1897. It was triggered by an English official, the consul James Phillips, who wanted to meet with the ruling Oba, Van Ramwen, but was asked not to do so because it was a religious festival. He went anyway, and his party was ambushed with many hundreds of people slain, a handful of Europeans and mainly African porters. The response was a raid by 1,200 British soldiers against Benin City. They were led by Admiral Harry Rawson, who captured the city and the royal palace complex, and its adjoining shrines were systematically looted. A certain Captain Walker, who kept a diary, recorded that, quote, all the stuff of any value found in the king's palace and surrounding houses has been collected. The photo, which you see here, an iconic image of colonialism, shows soldiers, British soldiers, posing proudly with their loot. The plunder was brought back to England, where some of it was kept by individual soldiers. The most impressive objects went to the British Museum, where they remain today, including the so-called Benin Bronzes, carved ivory, sculptures, and so forth. Lots were also sold off to private collections and museums around the Western world. And that was largely the end of the story until just the last few years. So what led to this turning point in circa 2020, more than 100 years after the fact? According to one source, and an article in the Smithsonian magazine back in March of 2022, credits years of institutional relationship building. An article in the New York Times, also from back in March, notes a different factor. Momentum to return the Benin Bronzes has gained steam in recent years as conversations about racism and the legacy of colonialism have proliferated. Thus, a combination of behind the scenes conversations, as well as public debate, a more public debate of issues, has laid the foundations for taking the next practical steps, and leading to repatriation. Taking actual action started around 2020 with the example and effort of a few selfless individuals. only then paving way for the institutions to follow suit. Most notably on this list includes Mark Walker, the grandson of Captain Walker, who, as you recall, took part in the attack on Benin City. The younger Walker personally returned 2 small sculptures, one of them a bronze bell, to the current Oba that were in the possession of his family. And he explained his actions as follows. They should just go back. It's the right thing to do. And if only it were, everything were so simple as that. A pair of British policemen, Steve Dunstone and Timothy Awoyemi, the latter of Nigerian descent, started a public relations campaign encouraging people and institutions to embrace the repatriation of Benin art. They had some small successes, again, especially with individuals being willing to return items. Over the next few years, gradually, art institutions have followed this lead, including the Smithsonian, as I mentioned at the beginning. Also in the US, the Metropolitan Museum agreed to return 3 Benin artifacts, including 2 brass plaques in its collection. Now, the Metropolitan Museum has been not just about African art, but has been sort of very reluctant to part with any of its collection. And some of that had to do with, and that's a whole other discussion about it being a flagship museum, meaning it's supposed to be the best one. And if it gives anything up, it stops being the best one. German museums have agreed to give up over 1,100 objects from a number of different museums, and not all of them from the Benin Kingdom. In France, the K. Branly Museum has deaccessioned some artifacts in the last few years. In the United Kingdom, Jesus College at Cambridge University, and especially the Horniman Museum in London, has joined these ranks. And the Horniman Museum recently agreed to return 72 objects from the Benin Kingdom. All of this has generated some momentum and put pressure on the institution, which was the biggest beneficiary of the Punitive Expedition of 1897, the British Museum. What has been their position on returning art? And again, this image is a view of some of the large collection of the bronzes, mostly actually brass, from the British Museum's collection. The short answer is not really, not much, but it's complicated. In recent years, new labels have been added to the exhibition space, which contains the Benin Bronzes, but that has only invited further criticism. The labels use the passive voice a lot, something that would have horrified my graduate school advisor, and is certainly not helpful in discussing responsibility. And while the labels contain kind of scholarly analysis of cultural significance of the objects, they don't say much about how the objects came to be there, or that their continuing presence was in any way problematic. Again, having said that, there have been some negotiations in recent years involving the Nigerian government the OBA, and the British Museum. As of 2020, talk was of loaning 300 bronzes for an exhibition in Nigeria to last 3 years, with the possibility to renew for a few more years. And theoretically, museums in Vienna and Berlin would also take part in this planned exhibition. Now, that's one potential compromise solution and a gesture of goodwill, but certainly doesn't change the status quo regarding the ownership, ultimate ownership of the objects. Of course, having such an exhibition presupposes having a museum to receive the objects. It's another issue, controversy, if you will, partly because the British Museum has a long history about claiming that only they possess the expertise and the facilities to properly take care of such sublime art. And that has not helped to resolve things. After close to 200 years with the so-called Elgin marbles from ancient Greece, and there is a museum in Athens to receive them, and that hasn't gotten resolved. But on the Nigerian side, the construction of a new museum in Benin City to display the artworks is in the works, scheduled to be completed if funding goals are achieved in 2025. The architect is David Ajayi, who famously designed the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington. Ajayi's take on the Benin Bronzes is this: restitution has to happen eventually, is the key word. The objects need to be returned. In the 21st century, this is no longer a discussion. There is continuing discussion, however, in the UK. The English Arts Council, the ACE, Arts Council of England, recently published updated restitution guidelines that govern institutions like the British Museum. And the report produced by the ACE is Restitution and Repatriation, a practical guide for museums in England. Now, it sounds like a good step, except that this document was almost immediately criticized for being overly bureaucratic, that is, creating more steps and more hurdles before anything gets done. And also, it makes scant reference to colonialism, to plunder, and any other such controversial issues. And the writer of a commentary, Dan Hicks of Hyperallergic, lauded a report written 4 years ago in France for the French government and about dealing with returning stolen art. And Hicks concludes that in order to face up to history, institutions like the British Museum, English government need to reference colonial violence, cultural dispossession, economic capitalization through the art market, symbolic capitalization through art museums, and so forth, in order for there to be hope of coming to terms with the past and with this legacy of plundered art. Now, when I last talked about the issue of returning stolen art 2 years ago, I gave a talk called Stolen Art from Napoleon to the Nazis. So it wasn't just on the Benin Bronzes. The cultural mood in 2022 is much more promising. So that's some progress. And there was a meeting held last month in Mexico City by the cultural arm of the United Nations, UNESCO, in which representatives of 150 countries made a commitment to expand efforts to, quote, return historical artifacts to their countries of origin. Ernesto Ottoni, a senior UNESCO official, declared at the meeting that in the last 3 years, there has been a change, a turning point on how restitution can be made. Today, doors are opening for us. An article talking about this meeting at the end of September 2022 is called Cultural Ministers Pledge More Action to Return Priceless Artifacts. And just by chance, less than 2 weeks ago, actually almost exactly 2 weeks ago, I happened to be listening to the BBC World Service on NPR on the radio. And a British commentator, and I didn't get to hear the beginning of the report, spoke out bluntly and openly about how the British Museum and other institutions need to acknowledge that they are holding certain objects illicitly, and they need to take steps to return them as soon as possible, period. That is what really needs to happen, and I think it can happen, but there must be further transparency and further publicity for this climate of restitution to be fully realized with respect to the Benin Bronzes, the Elgin marbles, and many other artworks that were either stolen or obtained under questionable circumstances. Thank you for listening, either voluntarily or pressured by your instructors. Wanted to leave time to take any questions, hear any comments, take part in some discussion, which could take place in the chat box or spoken directly.
We have one earlier question from Alice. Do any of the museums that are resisting returning items offer monetary compensation or rental agreements for getting to keep the objects?
Oh, so the question is whether in place of returning them, it's sort of either pay them or loan them. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, there have been a lot of sort of conversations and sort of discussions about this idea of, a sort of compromise solution, or at least temporarily. I haven't heard too many, haven't heard any cases of sort of paying money, but certainly of loaning objects. And another possibility was to make copies, because the ability to make copies now of things using 3D printers and whatnot is so good that, again, unless you're an expert, you couldn't tell whether something was the original or not. And that was sort of one commentator in England.
Maybe they should return these and I don't know, enlist forgers to make these, like people who are used to stealing these and replacing them with phony. Get these guys to make replicas.
Well, yeah, that'd be better than making art on the kind of underground art market. But I mean, that's one possibility. But again, that means someone's gonna feel like they have the copy, and then there's the original. So it doesn't solve the ownership problem, but there's a kind of step. And
and with them returning the originals.
Right. That would be best. I think returning the originals and then having copies in the other in the where they came from. So yeah, that's certainly one possibility, because it's not all going to happen at once. But I think it's encouraging that more and more museums are saying, okay, we have to really think about this, and that ultimately returning things is the right thing to do, which is why I think it was so striking that, you know, the Smithsonian came around and said, okay, we're going to give up this collection we have. You know, that's 29 objects. That's not several hundred, but that's certainly the right thing to do.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, you know, morally, you think returning stolen artwork should be, you know, number one on a list, but there are, at some level, saving the artwork should be number one. It's not worth anything if it's not worth saving. And of course, there are just some places, well, as you said, with Nigeria, you know, maybe artwork will be returned if there's somewhere they can return it to begin with. So you need to build a museum first. But, you know, I think back of, you know, when the Taliban blew up those Buddhist statues. I mean,
in Afghanistan, yeah.
Iraq war started in, what, 2003? There was a lot of looting of the museums.
In Baghdad, yeah.
Yeah. And so at some level, you have to think about the safety of the piece of artwork. Now, I'm not saying that Nigeria is on the verge of civil war or anything, but, you know, that also needs to be considered when, you know, entities are thinking of returning artwork to a nation, and the stability of the safety of that artwork in that nation.
Yeah. I mean, it makes a good point, because certainly, you know, we think of some things around the world are in a way the patrimony of everyone, and everyone should be able to enjoy them. But again, the problem is when, you know, some people decide that they're, you know, and it becomes an excuse that they're the ones who are best able to protect things, and then. You know, as with the, you know, British Museum, as I mentioned, the Elgin marbles, once, you know, one, you know, country sort of takes control of another country's art, it becomes, you know, all too easy just to keep that status quo, rather than, yes, maybe protecting them, but ultimately controlling them. And, you know, we should, you know, think about things like returning things right, but when things were, you know, kind of blatantly stolen, and that's, you know, with the Benin Bronzes, it's just obvious case. I mean, other instances, there are questions about the ownership of things, and, you know, that has to be figured out sometimes in court. But certain things you have to say, okay, let's start making arrangements, and not say, okay, we're gonna wait till you build something. You know, why not the you know, British government or some of these art institutions can contribute money towards that, and say, okay, you guys need to have a museum, but let's help you build one so you can have these objects back. And so it's a situation where sometimes, you know, protecting art, you know, becomes this sort of excuse to delay and just hold on to things when, you know, they shouldn't be there in the first place. But, you know, you make a good point.
I have a question. Do you know the narrative that you described in the beginning, the raid, the punitive raid?
Right.
Do the Brits you know, allow that is true, or do they have an alternative version of it?
Well, yeah, I mean, they say, you know, they over time, sort of for a long time, it was like, well, you know, we sent this party to, you know, just talk, to negotiate, and we were attacked, and so that response was a was a reaction to that. So basically saying, oh, we didn't attack first, so whatever happened after that is okay. That was the old sort of rationale behind it, that it was deserved in somehow. Mostly, one of the ways about sort of getting around having to deal with the kind of moral significance of the issue, besides, we talked about having museums, is just not talking about it. And that's what, some of the commentators, some of the articles that I was reading and preparing for this lecture, is that institutions are very good at sort of not talking about sort of causes of things, but just talking about things, well, this is how they are now, and we can work from that. And that becomes a kind of cover in a bureaucratic way for sort of ignoring, pretty straightforward claims. This is, again, one of those kind of blatant examples. We have the photographic evidence of what happened. And, at some point, the oboe were allowed back, I think after World War I, but the art didn't come back, and it was dispersed around the world. And I remember, years ago, studying art history and visiting museums and things like that, and wondering, that these museums have such great collections of Benin art, like all the, major Western museums. And it was just sort of distributed around, which made it even harder because now each institution on its own has to go through this process of deaccessioning. So it's going to take a long time.
I think we have another question in the chat from Leslie.
Okay.
Are there other reasons why Western museums aren't returning stolen art besides wanting to be the best museum or thinking only that they can protect the art?
Yeah, I mean, there's if you can think of an excuse or a reason, it's probably been offered. And part of the problem is, and this is a whole talk in itself, is about sort of the nature of museums in the Western world. And that, they came, we think museums are, these nice, quaint, educational institutions which have all of these objects, and they're showing them for the benefit of the public. But originally they really were places, going back to the first public museum in the West, the Louvre in France, which the original idea was to take the art which had just been used by rulers and now was open to the public. But soon after that kind of idealistic view, museums, and Napoleon is one of the ones who started this, became ways to display objects that were acquired through conquest. And some objects were theoretically sent to France as a result of treaties, but they were coerced. And so that meant that museums were these places where, like in that case, France was basically saying, we're the greatest power in the world, and we have all this great art, and we're the ones who get to show it off. And unfortunately, a lot of other museums, like the British Museum, kind of followed suit with that. And so that mentality has, caused a lot of these problems about not wanting to give anything up. And money, of course, is a big reason, but at least it's encouraging that museums in the last decade or two have really started to rethink their roles. And I think part of it, to get back to Montgomery College a little bit, is that the Paul Peck Humanities Institute has the kind of faculty exchange program with the Smithsonian, and getting museums to thinking more as about education and dealing with issues of the wider world. But again, getting back to your point, museums have come up with all possible excuses, and and bureaucracy is, many of them, like the Smithsonian, they're huge bureaucracies, and it's really hard to get things done. And you have curators at a museum saying, hey, we did research on this artwork, and this, it's not, we didn't, it's not, there's question marks about some of the transfers, and we need to probably return it. It could be years before that actually happens. Okay. Are there other things, Jennifer?
Yeah, I'm just looking to see if there's any more questions. I just wanted to note that after today's presentation, just please take a moment to fill out a short survey on returning stolen art and the Humanities Days series. We appreciate that in planning next year's event. And just to thank everybody for attending. But if there's any more questions, please feel free to speak up.
I have another question. Considering Britain's been at war with a lot of people and nations and some in Europe, did they have anything like that across Europe? Did they loot stuff from, I know that Germany.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry. Well, yeah, the sort of the Nazi German looting is a whole other thing, and that's still being sorted out because they looted so systematically. But yeah, like the interesting what's come up again. I mentioned the Elgin marbles, which is an old story, but now the British Museum also has the Rosetta Stone from Egypt. And the Egyptian government has asked for that back. I mean, that was originally stolen by Napoleon. And then because of a treaty with the British, it was given, it was taken over by the British, and they brought it back. So yeah, there's plenty of things like that. Again, not being a continental power, but being a colonial power, yeah, the British were seizing a lot of things, and that was felt to be, a kind of legitimate thing to do as a result of war, but also as a way to showcase, British imperial power, because they not only can control countries, either their territory or their economies, but their culture, and art. We don't usually think of it that way. We think of, colonialism as more about sort of territory, about people and about economics, but cultural part of it is very important, and that's another reason why it's important to get rid of that stain of colonialism, is to give back the art.
Are there any other questions? I just saw, we did just answer this one, right? From Angel, has there been any pressure from other countries except Benin so that UK can return the art?
Have there been pressures from other countries? Well, I mean, again, it's more that the example, I guess I sort of tangentially answer that, but it's more that, yeah, other countries are getting to that point, like Germany, France, United States, that there's getting to be this critical mass, which is really what needs to happen. Because someone usually starts it, and then again, museums now are going over their collections, and it was sort of easy sometimes not to ask questions about, oh, what happened to this artwork in the 1930s or 40s. Or how did it get to Europe in the first place? But those questions are being asked now increasingly, and that there's more of a demand from the public as well to have justice, in the end for these objects.
And did other colonial, British colonial powers like India have the same thing, that their works were looted?
Oh yeah. Now, yeah, interesting with India, right? I mean, within days after Queen Elizabeth died, there was a request for some diamonds, some of the royal jewels that were part of the collection of the English monarchy came from India, and Indian government asked for them back. I don't think that's going to happen. But yeah, so right away, and Queen Elizabeth partly represents that kind of symbol, for the UK's sort of what they consider glorious past. And yeah, so there are all kinds of things, connected to the monarchy, to museums, to the aristocracy. There's lots and lots of things that are not just in the British Museum, but that came from the British Empire, which used to say, in Queen Victoria's time, that the sun never sets on the British Empire. So they were in control of a lot, and that meant acquiring things using their power that they wanted.
I have a question. So I was wondering, it's seeming like these decisions are based solely off of these institutions and museums who currently have ownership of these artifacts. But I know earlier you were talking about representatives from over 150 different countries coming together, and I'm assuming coming up with solutions to this problem. So I guess my question is, are there other powers or, in our government or country that are capable of helping in this process of returning the art, or is it just, up to these institutions or museums?
Yeah, a lot of the decisions have been up to institutions, and in a way that's right. But certainly the governments could play, could also have influence. I mean, whether it's the UN, which can seem not very powerful, can certainly keep the issue in the forefront of people's minds. Again, government leaders can certainly use pressure and sort of encourage the process along. Again, there are legal channels and whatnot, but again, that leaving it to institutions though means that the pace is going to be pretty slow. And so yes, any other bodies, like the UN, and other prominent people have enough clout to do this would certainly help things along, because there's a lot of inertia, and it's been a long time. 1897 was a long time ago. Yeah, there certainly could be more being done, but it's encouraging that international bodies like the UN are also taking up this issue. Although of course there's still a lot of stealing and looting of art, including in Ukraine, sites in Latin America and in Africa. But there's also, again, more transparency with museums to not buy things that pretty likely looted from the site. There's definitely much more awareness and controls about that. So that's somewhat encouraging.
Alice just made a comment. I had the good fortune of visiting the British Museum, and it is a wonderful place to visit. So much to see, such variety and treasures. It's nice to see so much in one place.
Yeah. I mean, understandably, it's when you have you have some of these great museums, whether it's British Museum or the Metropolitan Museum of Art or the Louvre and others, which like to kind of outdo each other to have the most. And it is great for convenience to see things like that. But again, the fact that they're also, receptacles of things that, were looted or obtained illegally or through coercion, it's a problem. And the museums should not be tarnished by that.
Okay, do we have any more questions? Okay, well, I just wanted to thank everybody for attending today. And again, the SurveyMonkey link is in the chat. And there's any.
Put it in the chat, Jennifer.
Yep, it's in the chat. And please consider registering for some other Humanities Days events. We have events running through Friday, and there's a lot of good programming out there. So thank you so much for attending. And please fill out the survey for today's event.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Thanks for being here.